Bible is full of stories that we all know and love. But how well do we know them? The answer might surprise you. The Bible you thought you knew is going to dive deep into the exquisite details of the biblical stories that make them fascinating and transforming. In this week's podcast, we're going to talk about Eve. As soon as one hears that famous name, one immediately thinks of the first chapters of Genesis, which narrates the story in which Eve has such an outsized role. Of course, in thinking about Eve, one cannot forget Adam. Virtually everyone knows that Adam and Eve were the original couple at the beginning of creation. Even irreligious people, or those completely ignorant of the Bible, know that Scripture begins with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. Once again, however, the details of the biblical narrative paint quite a different picture. We have had ingrained in our heads through art, sermons, songs, poetry, Sunday school lessons, and the like, that Adam and Eve were the first human beings to inhabit the earth. But the Bible itself requires adjustments, perhaps serious adjustments, to our assumptions about the so-called first couple according to the book of Genesis. Let's take a look. In Genesis 1, where God creates the whole cosmic order in 6 days, human beings are created in God's own image, but the names Adam and Eve do not occur. When God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness," the Hebrew word Adam, in this instance, is a generic word referring to all humankind, not a specific man or a specific woman. Not only does the context suggest this meaning, but what the narrator says right after what God said confirms this interpretation. Verse 27 is the clincher. So God created man, that is, humankind, in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The emphasis in this chapter is that, 1, the creation of humanity is the crown of creation. 2, only human beings are made in the image of God. And 3, maleness and femaleness are the essence of humanity, an essence that bears the image of God. No one at this point is named. The details in the garden story are equally intriguing. At first, we are told that when God made the heavens and the earth, there was yet no vegetation. That's in verse 5 of chapter 2. 2 reasons for this condition are given. 1, God had not yet caused it to rain on the earth. And 2, there was no man to till the garden. In this context, the same word that meant humankind in chapter 1, in this chapter means a single individual male. However, though there was no man around to tend a garden, God did have moist ground because of a mist. So God took the damp ground, and from that substance fashioned a man, into whom the deity breathed the breath of life. That made the man a living being. Even though dust is the traditional translation in this case, any 3-year-old will tell you that you cannot make something from dust. Damp earth, though, is another matter. In this scene, God fashioned an individual male. God did not name the man. Instead, God planted a garden in the place, which was called Eden, and then put in the garden the man that the deity had just formed. That's in verse 8 of chapter 2. This was some garden, since God had made its trees not only pleasant to look at, but nourishing as well. Besides this cornucopia, God also planted 2 other trees. A tree of life was planted in the middle of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. This was the garden of which the man was in charge. That's in verse 15. When God assigned the task of taking care of the garden to this man, who was still unnamed, the deity announced that the man could eat anything that the garden produced, with one exception. The fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was forbidden. The man was not to eat that. God was quite serious about this. Should the man eat this particular fruit, he would most certainly die. That's in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 2. At this point, something strange happened. As wonderful as this garden was, and the fact that God had fashioned a man to farm it, God noticed that the man was alone. This was not good, as God saw things. That's in verse 18. To remedy this situation, God decided to make a helper appropriate to the man. So God went back to the drawing boards. Once again, God used the ground for the task. From this ground, God formed both animals and birds. Afterwards, God brought these new creatures to the man. God did this so that the man could name the animals. Whatever name the man came up with, that was the name that an animal or a bird had. That's in verse 19. The man named everything in this new creation, even though he himself had not been named. As marvelous as these creatures were, though, none of them proved to be an appropriate help to solve the problem that God had noticed, namely, that the man was alone. Once again, God had to go back to the drawing boards. This time the ground was no longer the material that God used for fashioning. Instead, God made the man go into a deep sleep, took one of the man's ribs, closed up the wound, and fashioned a woman. God immediately brought the woman to the man. That's in verse 22. At this point, the man, now Hebrew Ish, gushes over her with his famous poem, "This at last is my bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman," in Hebrew Isha, because she was taken out of a man, Hebrew Ish. The man here affirms that he is an Ish, and the helper appropriate to him is an Isha. The man makes no effort to hide his delight. At the same time, both the man and the woman remain nameless. They are not yet Adam and Eve. This is confirmed by the last verse of this chapter, when we are told that the man, now using the Hebrew term ha'adam, and his woman/wife, using Isha, were naked and unashamed. But these titles are hardly personal names. Of course, the woman has a strategic role in the scene where the serpent shows up for a chat. Though her role cannot be overstated, the text refers to her throughout this exchange as simply the woman. That occurs in chapter 3, verses 1, 2, 4, 6, 12, 13, and 16. In all those references, the text refers to her simply as Ha'isha, the woman. That varies only once or twice as the story develops. When the woman eats the forbidden fruit, she gave it also to her husband or her man, depending on how you want to translate, who was with her. That's in verse 6. Then, when the couple tries to hide from God, we are told the man, now using Ha'adam, and his woman, Isha, were hiding from God's presence. That's verse 8. Throughout this episode, the woman is called one way or another, simply the woman. Only in chapter 3, verse 20, does the woman actually get a name. The man does the honors. he named her Hawa, or Eve when anglicized, because that name resembles a Hebrew noun that means living. The rationale for the name, according to the man, was that the woman was the mother of all living creatures. That is, all human living creatures. The man's name becomes Adam at that same point, when we are informed that God made garments for Adam, now without the definite article, and his woman/wife, Isha. That's in verse 21. Curiously, though, when God muses about kicking the man and the woman out of the garden, all the emphasis is on the male character. God notes that the man has become like the deity, knowing good and evil, and now he may be tempted to eat the tree of life, so that he could live forever, so that he has to go. So the Lord sent him forth from the garden and drove him out of Eden. The only other time Eve is mentioned by name is Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, when we learn that Adam, the generic term has now become a personal name, had sex with Eve, now referred to once again as his woman or his wife. Her last line in all of Scripture is uttered in the context of her firstborn son. Even though New Testament writers, most especially the Apostle Paul, make much of Eve's role in introducing sin into the world, the garden story generally, and Eve particularly, play no such role in the narrative arc of the Old Testament. No prophet attributes Israel's sin to what had happened in the Garden of Eden. Blaming Eve, and in some cases blaming her almost exclusively, would, however, come much later. At the very least, the silence of the rest of the Old Testament about Eve's role in the garden story should be factored into the claims about how decisive were the actions of the woman in Genesis 3. Let me encourage you to go to my website, faspina.com, and let me know what your email is. Also check out the new site that has been recently redone. And if you have any question that you would like me to answer in a subsequent question and answer period, email me at fspina106@gmail.com. I want to thank you so very much for listening to The Bible You Thought You Knew. I have a question for you. Do you have a question or topic that you'd like me to cover on the podcast? If so, all you need to do is head over to Apple Podcasts and do two simple things. One, leave a rating and review telling me what you think of the podcast. Two, in that review, ask anything you want related to the Bible. That's all you have to do. Then, listen in to hear your question answered on a future episode. Join us next time on The Bible You Thought You Knew when we discuss Jesus' personal Bible. God bless.